I have
I'm really happy to be here today with Dante Diotalevi of the YouTube channel, one of my favorite YouTube channels now, Scientific Genius. And lest you think that he's arrogant twit, Scientific Genius is actually about the people that he is specifying on his channel, the people that he's sort of exploring. And so he takes a look at all these scientific geniuses through time, does a beautiful job with the visuals and connecting ideas. And for those who aren't familiar with Scientific Genius, I'm going to share screen for just a second and bring up one of his videos so that you have an idea of the kind of work that he does. I got interested in him because he did this video on Stephen Wolfram. And not content with just analyzing Stephen Wolfram's ideas, he went all the way back into the past and took a look at a guy by the name of Robert Flood. And you can see over here on the right, and actually as you move through the video, you can see all these amazing designs. I'm not going to play the video right now, but just to give you an idea of the kind of thing that he is analyzing, it's really fascinating, and he does an amazing job of doing the analysis. So I'm really excited to get to know you, Dante, and find out your story, how you got to this place. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your childhood, your background, how you ended up getting interested in science, and why you started your channel.
Sure, absolutely. It's great to be here too, Karen. Yeah, it's been a long road. Even though I'm only 31, it feels like a long road. I know that I've got a lot left to go. But the channel for me, the Scientific Genius channel, is just in a nutshell me trying to make use of my education. I've been in university, I guess, a total of 9 years already, and I have a master's in philosophy, undergrad in biology, and want to bring the ideas that I have from that education to life, and that's what the channel's really about. But just in terms of how I got interested in these ideas, I was a biology student in undergrad, and I was taking a course on game theory, specifically evolutionary game theory, and that really was the first time I got interested in mathematics. And I started using game theory in these kind of really creative ways, and I brought them to my professor, who was a postgrad student at the time, and he saw that I had this kind of creative aspect, and I needed to do something new. And so he gave me Wolfram's New Kind of Science. He said, look, well, he didn't give it to me, he told me about it, and I went up and bought a copy. And he said, look, if you want to be creative, like, check out this guy, right? Here's some stuff that's really cutting edge. And this would have been 2012. So
about 10 years after the book came out.
Yeah, just about the midpoint, because now it's the 20th anniversary. And so when I encountered that book, I was just at this point in my life where I was just very open to the ideas in it. And I feel like over time, right, especially seeing what's happened online, how everything's come together, there's a lot of people like yourself who also find Wolfram's creativity very provocative and intriguing in terms of, the upper limits of theoretical science. So, yeah.
So, but before you got into the bachelor's in biology, what generated your scientific interest as a kid? What was there about your growing up that generated that scientific interest?
Yeah, I mean, I was raised in a family that brought me to church, and my mom's side has priests and religious figures in it. But it never really spoke to me. I was never religious. I thought I'd go into biology just because maybe it would lead to a good career kind of thing, not really being super engaged with that. But I had an epiphany one day.
Could you hold it right there for just a second, Dante? I have somebody at my door. I'm going to have to go take care of that, and I'll be right back.
Totally, yeah.
Okay. So when we dropped out there for a second, you were just about to talk about your epiphany.
Yeah, and I've just got a few slides to kind of help explain this. Because yeah, I guess my life is really divided into two halves. The first half, the childhood, like you said, it was pleasant, it was good, and the mindset of the child, right? The world is as it is, and you're taken care of and all this. But my epiphany was the moment when I realized, things could be different, and I could have a hero's journey, and there's things to be discovered. So I just want to use these slides here to kind of illustrate that and help explain why I like Wolfram so much. I think I just need the screen share. Is that how we do this one?
Oh, yeah. Just a second. I can get you on there. There you go.
Thanks. Here we go. So go to reading view. Can you see the blank slate there?
I do.
Okay. So the epiphany, I guess, would be in terms of God. It's before the epiphany. God didn't make any sense. I saw no reason to use God in my life, and afterwards I did. So to help explain this, here's a illustration. This is from Ralph Cudworth's True Intellectual System of the Universe in 1978. Or 1678, sorry. Yeah, it's old. Anyway, on the left are Aristotle, Socrates, and Pythagoras, and they're the theists, and they have the banner of victory over them. And on the right are Strato, Epicurus, and Anaximander, the atheists, and they have the banner of confusion. And so when I'm reading Wolfram, right, I feel like I have to put him on the side of the atheists here. And it pains me because I think he has the mind and the spirit of a theist, but he's not recognizing the theological side of his work. So when I started to read Wolfram, I was reading NKS as a work of alchemy, and I might be in a minority of one there. I'm not sure. This is really just kind of my personal understanding of Wolfram when he's talking about the work he's doing and the work in NKS. So this image here, which is from Robert Flood, kind of summarizes my understanding of what Wolfram's talking about. Right? When I read NKS and listen to Wolfram speak, I'm thinking of something like this. And it's beautiful image, 1619, it's pretty old. Just taking a look here though, the tetragrammaton at the top, those four figures are really key. You can see they're holding on to the Anima Mundi, holding on to man. So how this relates to Wolfram, actually this next slide is from my video that you mentioned, right?
Mm-hmm.
So here's the cellular automaton model of space-time. And I'm looking at this, and this was 10 years ago, and I saw the tetractys there, and then, of course, the tetragrammaton has the same arrangement, the same layout. This image here is from Jakob Böhme, who was a German mystic before Flood. And so when I'm reading the NKS book, to me, this is a work of transformation. It's a work of ancient symbolism and wisdom. And for a long time, I thought, well, this is just kind of in my head. Like, I don't think anyone else sees it like this. You know what I mean? It's a very hot take, I guess.
Well, the other thing that I see in this, when I look at it this way, is Carl Friston's Markov blanket, which I don't know if you've looked at that at all, but I did a whole conversation about a year and a half, 2 years ago, maybe, about the Markov blanket and how it seems to come down to something very similar to what you would call a family. There's mother and father, and then there's the babies, and so it's very much this relational thing, and it looks, in some respects, it looks very identical to this. So
I did see the Markov blanket thing, and to me, it was all about the inside and the outside.
Yeah. Yep.
Right? You've got an inside and an outside to a circle or a sphere or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Me.
Well, everything has an inside and an outside. That's what makes the world so interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to say about Wolfram here has a historical precedent, and I think maybe this will kind of help to explain. I don't know if I'm going too deep into this now or not.
Oh no, this is very exciting. I'm into it. Keep going.
Okay, sure. So you see the cellular automata model on the left there,
Mm-hmm.
model. And then you see the tetragrammaton arranged in the same kind of triangular structure, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it has this symbolic element. Well, one of the most famous scientific thinkers of all time is Johannes Kepler, right?
Mm-hmm.
Laws of astronomy. And Kepler had an epiphany. One day, Kepler drew this diagram on the chalkboard during one of his lectures. He was making some other demonstration, but as he drew this on the chalkboard, he had this huge insight that, wow, the ratios of these shapes are the same as the distances between the planets. Right? And then he starts to build his whole harmony of the world from this insight. And he wrote, this is all in Arthur Koestler's book, The Sleepwalkers, which is the history of this kind of thinking from Pythagoras to Copernicus and Kepler, and then a bit of Newton. Very interesting story. And the reason why I'm into Flood is because Kepler later found Flood's book at a book fair in Germany. And one of the first images that Kepler would have definitely seen in the book is this, right? So Kepler goes to the book fair, he finds this book. It also has a profound effect on him, but the effect is not one of inspiration, it's one of negation and criticism. And he writes against Flood. He publishes this appendix at the end of Harmony on the World saying, well, this isn't science, this is alchemy, this is mysticism, it's not really knowledge, it's just kind of like a private delusion. And that rejection to me is that encapsulates the problem here, not just with Wolfram, just with scientific thinking, is that we're using these models like the cellular automaton without recognizing how they could be a symbolic or alchemical sort of treatise.
Mm-hmm. Well, for just 1 second though, what was it that Johannes Kepler found repugnant about this? Because I thought that Kepler was a pretty devout believer in God. So why would he find this so repulsive?
It's a really good question. He rejected the Pythagorean speculations in general in the harmony of the world. And this is part of the early modern attitude, right, of breaking with tradition and not following any sort of creed or doctrine and really trying to have a new beginning that you see with Descartes, for example. In my opinion, we carry the spirit forward that scientific thinking is sort of created out of nothing, and that we don't have roots anymore to our thinking that can be consciously sort of used and employed. And that kind of runs into a deeper thesis about the nature of science today, right? Where, again, I think Wolfram has some fantastic insights. Wolfram's right on the money, right? But he's still confused about some aspect of what he's doing, in my opinion.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I have some really interesting clips to show you as we move along. So
cool. The other aspect, of course, with Kepler rejecting this is that Flood uses the tetragrammaton, which is a symbol for God that is distinct from Deus. You see the three names of God here. That's the Trinitarian concept of God. And if you read Carl Jung's essay on the psychological dogma of the Trinity, right, he's talking about how the numbers 3 and 4 are significant in terms of how we understand God. So Flood is using both concepts of God. And with the fourfold idea, this last slide here, this doesn't just bottom out in symbolism. We don't just say, okay, look at this match, it's interesting. Like Flood has an entire system where all of the science we do, all of the cellular automata are in that bottom triangle. They're all in that reflection, the reflections of being, or in Aristotle's terminology, they're all a science of being qua being. The being is kind of above it, but we can't really have a science of it. So Flood gives us this dichotomy and then uses that as the foundation for his system. And it goes extremely in depth, right, in terms of the 4 circles being shown below. So it gets, very intricate. It doesn't just stop at this kind of, oh, isn't that an interesting symbolism? It's like, no, this can satisfy every criterion of scientific thought today. To me, this is Rule 30, right? When Wolfram looked at Rule 30, I look at this and I get the same thing. It's pockets of reducibility, and it's right there, but it has this symbolic element that roots itself in tradition, a tradition that we've become so distant from and that is so foreign to the way we think now that it's a huge challenge. We have to kind of kick the ladder away out from under us, or as Wolfram says, science is eating itself from the inside out. this is the catalyst to me.
Well, so could you go into a little bit more depth on the thing on the right now? Because I totally get the one on the left. I see what's happening there. And how does that relate to the one on the right?
Sure, yeah. So, well, I'll preface this with saying that there is no sort of uniform interpretation of the hieroglyphs, right? This is symbolic material that is inherently going to be uh, not ambiguous, but it's like the cellular automaton, right? It just does its thing, and then we find different ways to understand it or interpret it.
Mhm. Well, I mean, the way Wolfram always talks about it is we see this slice of computational reducibility that only we can see because we're an observer within the system. So you're an observer within that system and you see it probably a different way than anybody else does, but that's what makes your view so valuable. So
Sure,
go for
sure,
it.
yeah. And this whole project with Flood really is just my attempt to take Wolfgang Pauli seriously, because he was the one who wrote about Kepler and Flood in this book, published with
Mm.
Carl Jung's essay on synchronicity.
Synchronicity. Okay.
Yeah, so I'm just taking Pauli seriously. I'm really trying to put his essay into action. Um, and maybe it's working for me, and that's also another purpose for my channel, is that I'm trying to see if it works for other people in this area.
So the one on the right, you were going to talk about the
Sure,
symbolic
sure.
nature of that.
So here's the Markov blanket, the inside and the outside. Okay, if you notice the very bottom four of the formal pyramid below the or above the triangle at the very bottom
Mm-hmm.
there is
Yeah.
actually outside of the outer circle, the outer region.
Mm-hmm.
And Flood's even dotted that triangle to show that this is some kind of quantity that's outside the realm of what we would consider to be a system. So that's just one example. The symbol of the sun having one outside and one at the sphere of equality, where form and matter are equal. So this is how he builds a foundation of ratios that actually leads to a recursive system at one point. He shows recursion within this. There's a whole sequence of images, right? Like this is just one entry point. But the message I'm trying to convey is the same as Wolfram's Rule 30. It's like we can't predict, it just keeps going, and there's more and more and more. And these, I think, are pockets of reducibility that were identified a long time ago.
Well, so the whole recursion thing, does that tie up in your mind with things like Mandelbrot sets and Julia sets and things like that?
Yeah. To me, that is sort of evidence of science theorizing its own sort of destruction, in a sense, or endless sort of analysis, right? Which
Mm-hmm.
is, yeah, you can analyze forever, man, but what we're really after is synthesis. We're really looking for connections and,
Mm-hmm.
and new ways of seeing things, right? Because we can clarify things forever. John Vervaeke is amazing at analyzing things, and he's really
Mm-hmm.
bringing a lot together as well. But to really turn from analysis to synthesis is huge. It's a huge change. Um,
Yeah. So I guess that's one of the reasons I like listening to Jonathan Pajot is that he's always synthesizing things. Well, yeah, in a way.
yeah.
Yeah. So one of the reasons that we wanted to talk was this whole issue of, was that the fourth slide, by the way? You said
Yeah,
you had
that
four.
that
Yeah.
was it. Yeah, just to kind of introduce sort of where I'm at and how I see Wolfram, which I know is different.
Well, I want to play a couple of clips here that'll give us a kind of a foundation for where we go from here, because I know one of the things that we wanted to talk about was this whole issue of identity over time. Because that's
Yes.
one of the things that Wolfram brings up, that in not only in his system, but in any system, how do you account for identity over time? Especially if everything is just made of particles that have, you know, how I think they say now that there are 25 different kinds of fundamental particles that make up the universe.
Yep.
But so then there's this really interesting thing between Wolfram and one guy that he's talking with. see if I'm on the right spot here. Yeah. So he's talking with some guy named James, and they are discussing Eames. Now, they're using Eames as a way of describing space. You know how he talks about in his world, space and time are two separate things. Space is the atoms of space that make up space. They're actual like particles, or he calls them atoms. Well, now they're calling them Eames. So the particulates of space are Eames, and then time updates the location of these, or the relationship of these Eames. And every instance of time is an updating event of where these Eames are. So they're talking about Eames in this spot right here.
Okay, so what I realized is, so what James commented on is in the Rulliad, the entangled limit of all possible computations, what is the raw material on which the Rulliad operates? The raw material are Eames, E-M-E-S, which are atoms of existence. And in the case of space, those are instantiated, we can think of those as atoms of space. So the issue is, and I'm going to go, we get to actually use this again. Thank goodness for that. Hyper-Rulliad. It has not seen a lot of use yet. Okay, so James's observation is that the proof of uniqueness of an Eame, of an atom of existence, cannot be made in the context of the Rulliad alone, but requires regression to the hyper-Rulliad. Okay, so
just for some context, right? So Eames have to, they possess two properties. So the first is that they exist, which is important, and the second is that they have UUIDs. Okay, they have to exist because if Eames don't exist, I mean, they're the primordial building blocks of the Rulliad. So if Eames don't exist, then the Rulliad doesn't exist. But they also have to be unique, because if they're not unique, you can't distinguish between them. And I would say if you can't distinguish between the Eames, then there's no reason to say that there are multiple Eames, and then you basically have a big crunch in the Rulliad and the whole thing will collapse. So you have to have both of them.
So let's stop right there for a second and talk about that idea.
Okay.
Had you seen this before?
No, I didn't see anything there. I just heard audio, but
No, I mean, there's no visual there. They're just talking.
Oh, okay.
They do these working sessions where they take some problem and then they just talk to each other for several hours. And so I've been listening to some of those while I'm working, doing stuff, because you kind of have to listen to an hour and a half, 2 hours of it before something pops up that you go, oh, well, I see where that synthesizes, right? So he says here that Eames are the raw material that are operated on by the Rulliad, and the Eames are the atoms of space. And, we've all seen how that works out, the nodes and the edges. The edges are the relationships between the Eames. And then time is the updating of the events. So he says, now they have these raw materials, the atoms of space. And he's talking, and James has this idea that the proof of the uniqueness of the Eame requires a regression to the hyper-Rulliad, which is kind of like the Gödel's idea that within the system, you can't, there are some things that cannot be proven. Well, James is saying that the uniqueness of each Eame cannot be proven from within the Rulliad itself. You have to regress to the hyper-Rulliad. But he's also saying that if each Eame is not unique and particular, then the whole structure of the universe collapses. So basically, to me, what that's saying, the implication is that you can't reduce the universe to 25 kinds of particles, because they would not each be unique. Everything in the universe has to be unique or the universe collapses. That's what they're saying, basically. So I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's still kind of about that identity problem to me. which I heard you bring up multiple times, which I think was such a brilliant insight when I heard you first say that, because that set my brain off. Just the idea that we don't move through space. Space is us, and like we kind of have this unique identity system that just kind of carries us through that. My take on this is that Wolfram is proving that the question of seated Socrates and standing Socrates being different is a valid question. And that's a big deal.
So tell us about that question, because
sure,
you're a philosophy guy.
I'll try to explain that. Yeah, for sure. So in the metaphysics, in Aristotle's metaphysics, he's talking about who else other than the philosopher would ask whether seated Socrates and Socrates are the same. And it's kind of a silly question at first. And there's an important distinction here, because sophistry is kind of, for the Greeks, is imitative reasoning. It's bad reasoning in that sense, right? The sophist is someone who's maybe going to trick you. And this is kind of a classic move, right? Like, oh man, like a stoner question, like, oh, do you think that you die every time you stand up, kind of thing, right? And Aristotle is mentioning that the dialectician and the sophist might ask this question, but they don't ask it correctly. Only the philosopher does. And so to me, Wolfram's physics is really showing that, like, you know what? It might be a sophist question, it might be dialectician's questions, but it's definitely a philosophical question, because it's a scientifically possible state of affairs. And that to me is huge.
Well, I've heard Wolfram talk about this idea that if we are just a collection of particles, well, whether it's his system or the quantum system, the idea that every time I move my arm through space, something has to be holding my arm together or giving it identity as it moves through space, because it would be moving through all of these wave potentials, and what's holding it together, right? And so that's the idea of Socrates sitting and Socrates standing. Are they the same Socrates? It's like the same thing. I mean, it's another scale of, am I the same Karen today as I was 10 years ago, because I'm a completely new set of cells, right? From what I was then.
Yep. So I'm wondering, Karen, are you curious about these as questions, or are you looking for possible answers to them?
I'm looking for answers. Let me show you something I wrote today, because the other day I had a conversation with Grizz Grimm, which I haven't posted yet. I think it publishes tomorrow, but he published it on his site last week. And he had an idea, which I thought was a very interesting idea. He said, there's a deep connection between sacrifice and the collapse of the wave potential. Because sacrifice at its essence is opportunity cost, basically. At any choice that you make, you're waylaying all the other choices that you could have made, right? They're gone. You can only make this one choice. Yep. And so I was thinking about this whole thing about Michael Levin and his multicellular organisms, where, have you watched any of his stuff? He's a biochemist and you're a biologist. I'll put you on to some Michael Levin. It's kind of mind-blowing. He works with these multicellular organisms, and he's found a way through bioelectric signaling to teach them how to regrow a leg, or, like, for example, a salamander will regrow a leg naturally, but a frog will not. If a frog's leg gets amputated, it will not regrow a leg. But they've found a way that if they give it a certain electrical signal, the cells will execute a subroutine, build a leg here, and they will build a leg. Okay.
Yeah.
So he's also one who does not realize the implications of what he's talking about, because he's always using this language of evolution provided us with this, and evolution provided us with that, and evolution gives us all these gifts. And that's the kind of language that he uses.
Sure.
But what he's not thinking about, I don't think, is he's not thinking about Well, first of all, where does the subroutine come from? How is that so conveniently packaged up that it knows how to build an eye or it knows how to build a leg? but also, when they're building an eye or a leg, how is it that they work together to accomplish this without getting in each other's way, right? I mean, any construction job like that is going to require some sort of a conductor or something. So I was thinking about this in relation to a conversation that I had with Glenn, my physicist friend, where he talks about the symphony of choices over time.
Yeah.
Okay. And so I was thinking about that. So I wrote this little thing. I'll put it up on the screen here. See if I can find it. Can you see that?
I can, yeah.
Okay, maybe I can blow it up a little bit bigger. Can I make it bigger? Zoom in. Is that big enough to read?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay. So in a small multicellular organism, you can read the electrical states of the organism at each moment in time and see how it's communicating and how it's changing. I apologize, there's some errors in here because I was using voice activated stuff. Each one of those states is a point in time, and at each point in time, there's a choice to be made. Much like a pianist or a musician must read the score to see which note to play next, that note, rather than any other note, brings the whole symphony into reality. There must be some way in which the living cell is an observer, is capable of assessing the states around it in order to know what its next state should be. And assessing the states is, in some sense, the bringing into particularity what was only a wave of potential. So why does Jordan Peterson use music as his exemplar of a place to experience meaning? I think it's because the process of writing a piece of music requires a concentrated subsidiary focal integration that is continually making choices, this note rather than that note, over a wide range of choices and levels of instrumentation, all of which requires a sacrifice of time, energy, mental focus, a continual internal debate that probably requires bringing up all sorts of other attitudes and feelings, so that when we listen to the piece of music and we hear all of those choices coming together, we are hearing manifestation of the concept that it is sweeter after difficulty. Now, this sweeter after difficulty comes from a Latin phrase, which I can't remember what the Latin phrase is. I heard it in a movie the other day. But I mean, obviously, it's the idea that when you go through difficult times, or you experience anomalies, or you go through chaos, you come out the other side and you have a different understanding of the way the world works, right? So when we hear the beauty and the power in a piece of music where all the layers come together, we're not only experiencing how it affects us emotionally, but we're also experiencing in some way the connection to the composer who went through all that difficulty to produce this thing for us. And then we have a connection with them, right? So if we take this down to the very most basic level and just look at a cellular automata, and here's where a new kind of science comes in, right? And I'm thinking about this because Glenn sent me this assignment the other day. He said, try to put yourself in the place of that cell and think about what it would be to be that cell in the cellular automata in a Rule 30 or a Rule 110. Okay? What would it take to have a cellular automata that could execute the pattern on its own? Not to have a programmer or a Turing machine or something executing the pattern, but the cellular automata is automatous, right? Autonomous. It can execute on its own. The cellular automata, this is my thinking, would have to have an awareness of its own state and the state of the cells on either side of it, and it would have to have an awareness of the rule. Then all that is necessary is for the cell to execute the rule. So here's the cell thinking, okay? Right now I'm a black square. I have a black square to my left and a black square to my right. And the rule says that when that happens, I become a white square in the next iteration. So the pattern only arises when every cell in the community of cells is also executing the rule. And is this a picture of what's happening in these organisms who are building these structures? Each cell is aware of its own state and the state of its neighbors, and the cell knows the rule. So the cell executes the rule, and all the other cells execute the rule. And the new state arises. In this way, it can move in an orderly fashion towards the combination of whatever it is the cells are trying to build. But there is a rule, hello, and each cell has to have enough cognition or awareness of its own state in the state and the states of its neighbors. Can I edit as I go here? This is so frustrating. I don't know why the voice thing is so lame. Has to have an awareness of its own state and the states of its neighbors. In a multicellular organism, it's not just a simple line of cells like in a cellular automata. It's a three-dimensional collection of cells all around, and it must have a capacity to assess the states of every one of those cells. Is that kind of like the three-body problem where it becomes computationally irreducible? That's what I was thinking about this morning, so I wrote myself that note. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I want to say I'm glad that you like Jordan Peterson, fellow Canadian.
Are you a Canadian too?
Yeah, I'm a couple hours from Toronto. So
what is it about that area? I mean, Peterson, Vervaeke, there's so many other people that are incredibly inventive and creative coming out of that area. Is Wolfram also a Canadian?
No, he's from the UK.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I guess I know that based on the way he talks. So
yeah. No, I remember when Peterson was becoming very famous because of the bill C-16.
Mm-hmm.
I had just left university though, so I wasn't at ground zero for that because the universities were really the hotspots. He was going around giving these talks and people were protesting.
Mm-hmm.
And just following him through those years and seeing the way he's really kind of built this intellectual system for his persona. I don't know who he is deep down, obviously, but he's just really done well. Yeah, it's cool. So
did you become interested in him at that time and start reading his books and whatnot, or did it have an influence on you?
Yeah, it's been a slow climb to basically Jungian psychology, I guess, right? And Peterson was one of the modern entry points for a lot of people, especially younger generations. They don't teach Jung in school, really, right? So that's been huge for me. When did you first hear about him? Did you hear after he was already kind of passed?
No, I think I heard about him before, but it was one of these odd things where I just stumbled on YouTube. I stumbled onto a thing that was called 10 Rules for a Better Life. Not 12, 10. And somebody had just done a little compilation of Peterson talking in his classes. They'd, taken snippets from his classes and some of the things from, he used to appear quite regularly on Canadian television. And so they had taken little clips here and there of some of his basic rules on how to have a better life, how to avoid depression, how to be more motivated, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
And I was listening to him and I thought, this guy sounds so sensible. I mean, he just sounds like the way the world was when I was growing up instead of the way it is today. And a lot of his thinking aligned with the way that I thought about things. And I thought, I just want to expose my family to this. So I got it was some Mother's Day, I think. And I said, okay, what I want for Mother's Day is for everybody to sit down and watch this video. That was my gift, right? It was like a 10-minute clip or something, and they all watched it. And most everybody was not too captivated by it. But my older daughter decided that it was kind of motivational. So she started listening to Peterson when she was cleaning house or when she was organizing. And she said she could listen to 5, 6, 7, 8 hours of his stuff while she's organizing. It was very motivational to get the work done, right? I don't know that it influenced her beyond that, but I started getting fascinated with him, particularly when he did the biblical series then, because I had just had surgery and I needed to stay off my feet for several weeks. And so I just plowed through as much. He was halfway through the series when I started listening to him. So I binge watched all that. And then I started watching week by week as he went through the rest of it. And when he was talking, these memories would come up in my mind of, oh, yes, this is the thing. This is the lesson God taught me in 1984 when this happened in my life. And that's the lesson God taught me in 1996 when this other thing was happening. And little things I had jotted down in my Bible, lessons that God had taught me, just slotted right into what he was talking about. And I thought, this is very interesting. So then I read Maps of Meaning, and then I read it again, and then I started reading it again. And as I read Maps of Meaning the first time, I couldn't quite understand him because I don't have a background in philosophy or psychology or science. And he was talking way over my head, and his language is very dense anyway. Every sentence contains a chapter. So I couldn't quite understand him. But at one point, all of a sudden, it kind of fell into place with my own thinking about art and creativity, things that I've learned over the years. And I could map the language of Maps of Meaning onto this artistic language. And that was kind of like a translator key for me. And then the whole thing just opened up. And I just really enjoyed that whole thing. And my favorite chapter is chapter 4, where he talks about anomaly and the effect of anomaly. And I realized you could take that anomaly effect all the way down to the cell level and think about adaptation and increase in the information that's contained in the DNA from simpler to more complex. And I realized that it would be a way to talk to scientists, even if they don't get the underlying implications. At least you could talk symbolically about what's happening in those levels. So
right. Well, the thing you wrote and shared with me there was great. I mean, having those thoughts is wonderful, but what I want to know, I guess, is how that connects with your understanding of living a better life. Like how you said you found Jordan Peterson, like 10 ideas. How does that fit together for you, the science and the living, I guess?
Well, okay, that's a really interesting question.
Because you're asking fantastic questions, but I guess I'm still at the point where it's like, what's the motivation for you on this?
What then? Yeah, it's like I used to go to a church where the pastor taught us for a while that after he teaches something, we're supposed to say, okay, what then? Like, how do you apply this? Where does this go in your life? And that's one of the things that a lot of stuff that he was teaching, I had already learned, adopted. My life was already going that way. But one of the things that he talked about that was very helpful to me, because I had actually about a year before starting to listen to him, I had discovered on my own that I was far too politically involved, and it was affecting my view of the world, affecting the way that I dealt with relationships. It was making some relationships difficult, and it was making me anxious. And so I had backed off and stopped listening to the news and had decided on my own that I was going to try to see the world in a more balanced way. But then when I started listening to him and he talked about the dangers of ideology, I thought, yes, that's it. That's the problem right there. And so one of the things that I've tried to do is not only allow that to kind of rewrite my own way of thinking about the world, but to include that in the way that I talk about things on my channel so that I can help other people not get trapped in that process. And I guess Vervaeke and Peterson together kind of showed me that all these things line up, that they're all a kind of addiction. Vervaeke talks about agape being the reciprocal opening to more beauty and possibility, but that addiction is a reciprocal narrowing, where you get more and more and more tied into this one thing that becomes all important to you. And if your focus is on just that one thing, everything else, basically you're sacrificing everything to this one idea. And so your whole life becomes meaningless. And I've had a problem with sugar addiction through the years. And so I've really tried to implement that vision of not letting your life narrow down to this. When am I going to get my next hit, of sugar, which it sounds silly, but anything like that can take over your life, where you're sitting there doing something and you think, I just need a little something. That's a key. That's some kind of addiction that's taking over. And so that's one of the things that I've used in my life. The thing about anomaly that I find fascinating is not just from the scientific standpoint, but it's a way of looking at the world so that we can think of the anomaly, the difficulty, the obstacle as being a gift. And if we think of it that way, then it changes our whole approach to dealing with it. So, I mean, it would be things like that. It would be more a shift of perspective that changes the way that you deal with situations. Does that answer the question at all?
Totally. Yeah. And so for me, synchronicity is the anomaly, at least in my life, synchronicity was the anomaly. Because if it's allowed to happen like that, then either everything is caused by divine providence or there's no causality at all. Like, that's kind of how I saw it, right? And that was my jump into the ocean of the unknown, because then all bets are off and you can go insane if you don't know what you're doing. I didn't know what I was doing, right? So I was losing it. I was really losing it because I was so, for a while I was kind of channeling stuff, right? And I didn't know what I was doing. And then after that, I didn't want to engage with the world at all. So for me, like, I just to answer my own question from earlier, I guess, and respond to your answer, right? This is about doing what matters to me. But the ironic part is that I think what I'm doing is participating in the very thing that has to end. And that is science, right? That's why I like Wolfram's recent video. He's going over the 20-year anniversary of NKS, right? He's done all these videos. And I'm thinking I should go comb through them and do a little highlight reel. Because this idea of science eating itself from the inside, it's like, let's hasten that process, right? Or to use Ludwig Wittgenstein had this idea of the ladder, right? That you climb up it and kick it away when you're done. And I think we're getting to that point, right? Wolfram's at the top of that ladder right now, and he's saying, like, come on, guys, get up here, and then let's get rid of that and move on, sort of thing. But he doesn't have the self-awareness to see himself in that position yet.
Well, so what, in your mind, what would kicking away the ladder represent?
Oh, showing how all of this is just nonsense. So much of what we're talking about is not right. We're making category errors left and right. Scientific thinking begins with self-negation. And so much of what we're doing is just a castle in the sky. And part of the reason here is that we're all under this spell of rationality, right? Like, it's this, we're all of our time, right? And we're all trying to, like, get out of it somehow. And so you can rationalize anything. You can rationalize magic, right? But you're not going to have what you think is magic. You're going to have a rationalized magic. It's not the same thing. So it's a real puzzle. So the ladder is what we're climbing up together collectively right now. And the work done by Wolfram is showing us things like the Socrates seated problem, right? These paradoxes of reasoning that originally were meant to point us towards unity and wholeness, right? But now we're still analyzing, we're dividing. Logic isn't bringing stuff together enough. It's still classifying and dividing, and you can do that forever. That's the trap.
Well, I'm going to put the Wolfram video in the show notes, because I want you to go back and start. I'll show you where I started in that little bit, and then you follow on at there for maybe 10, 15 minutes. I can't remember exactly how far. And they start into a discussion of Well, if the decision about uniqueness cannot be made in the Rulliad, but has to be made in the hyper-Rulliad, then probably it cannot be made in the hyper-Rulliad and would have to be made in a hyper-Rulliad. And then it couldn't be made there, but would have to be made. And then he uses the analogy of the turtles all the way down. And he said, basically, then it's just a infinite regression of hyper-Rulliads. And I'm like, Stephen, Wolfram doesn't have to be an infinite regression of hyper-Rulliads. You can stop at the one. If you think of the one as being who the one is, instead of imagining that you have to logically keep regressing, it's like he's making such a simple philosophical decision in the wrong direction. And
Absolutely.
yeah, it's
And
very
part of the draw
frustrating.
of this is the simplicity, right? That's what's so great about it, was that these simple programs give us these unpredictable results. Like, that is such an elegant idea.
yes.
It's starting to complicate it again.
Yeah, because I think the implication is too much for him. When he first started talking about it, he said, there's a rule, there's some sort of a simple rule that makes all this happen. And then he started thinking about that over time. You could watch his videos go, and he's thinking, well, if there's just one rule, why is it that rule and not some other rule? So then it must be all possible rules at all possible times. And I thought, okay, I can go with that too. But it's really more elegant if it's just the one rule. But if it's the one rule, you have to make some huge philosophical, theological leap that he's not willing to make, because it's like you were talking about rationalizing the magic. Let me show you another little video clip here. This is Michael Levin, and I think it's on here. Yeah, so this is Michael Levin. And Michael Levin is this biochemist who does the bioelectric signaling. And he did an episode on his university website where they're trying to get to know the professors. And so he does kind of a little presentation here of all of his ideas. And in the midst of this presentation, he does this.
In the space of anatomical structure versus the space of behavior or other things that we normally associate with intelligence.
Can you hear that?
And yep. So let's ask that question. How do tissues know what size and shape to be? So this is a cross section through a human torso. So look at this incredible order. All the tissues, the organs, everything is in exactly the right place, the right size, the shape, organization next to each other. Just amazing. Where does it come from? Because we all start life like this. These are all embryonic blastomeres that have to work together to build this exact thing every single time. Where is this pattern specified? Now, you may be tempted to say DNA. And the important thing about that is that we can read genomes now. And we know that when you read DNA, you read the genome, you don't see anything about the shape or size or symmetry or structure of the final organism. What you see is a description of the cell level molecular hardware. You see all the little proteins that every cell gets to have. But you still have this amazing question of, now having had that hardware, how is every cell going to communicate, cooperate, and compete with each other to make something like this? What's the software? Okay. So how do the groups of cells know what to make and when to stop? As workers in regenerative medicine, if something is missing, we'd like to know how to convince these cells to rebuild. And as engineers, we actually also want to go further and say, well, what else can we build? Instead of this, with the same genome, what are these cells willing to build if we were to communicate with them? So I've shown you that the collective intelligence of groups of cells has anatomical goals. And one of the questions you might ask about that is, how do they know what those goals are? How does the system, how does a collective intelligence represent its goals? How does it keep track of its goals? And in order to answer this in my lab, we took some inspiration from the brain, because that's, of course, a basic system that we know there's a collection of cells inside each of us that's able to carry out all kinds of goals. And so that's our inspiration, the way it works in the brain.
Okay, so he's one of the few biologists that I've run into that is willing to talk about goals. Most of them won't even use the word goal because it's too close to that nasty philosophical word telos, which indicates that there's some sort of purpose for all of us and we're all headed somewhere, right? But He points out the problem very clearly there. What dictates that shape? And how did the cells have the goal of how to make that shape? And but he is the same kind of a guy where he's rationalizing the magic. He's found a way to do the magic, to do the regenerative medicine, to regrow the leg. He's also found a way to he can take a bunch of frog cells, the cells from frog skin, so they're not stem cells, they're just skin cells, put them in a petri dish with the right kind of medium, let them sit for a while by themselves, and they will actually self-organize and make another kind of a creature. It will have the same DNA as a frog, but it doesn't look anything like a frog, because they kind of cluster up into a little ball, and then the cilia that are part of the cell get on the outside and act as a motive power. And so they move around through the water this way. And they also have, their goal is just to be alive. And so they gather into a little community to be alive together. He's playing with fire here. He has no idea what he's doing. And when people ask him about it, he gets very angry and he says, look, I'm trying to solve problems here to make a better world for everybody. Right? And isn't that what scientists are always doing? Taking everything apart and trying to solve problems to make a better world. And then we keep catapulting towards this cliff.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and this is where I guess I agree with like Vervaeke in the whole meaning crisis thing, but maybe I have a very kind of like, I see scientism everywhere here, right? Like that's maybe kind of why like I'm setting myself up against things like that. But I try not to resist. I'm trying to be for things, not against them. So
yeah, well, that's why I like what you're doing with the whole going back and looking at Robert Flood and trying to figure out well, so what was his background? How did he happen to stumble into those ideas?
Flood?
Yeah.
He traveled Europe as a young man, and he was a physician, medical doctor. So he was like highly educated. He had all the access to things and like the fancy German press and everything. And I wrote my master's thesis on like the Kepler-Flood polemic, basically, but only really because Wolfgang Pauli wrote about it first, right? I'm just following Pauli's thread because he said, "Hey, look, this is where the modern scientific mindset happens." The Kepler-Flood polemics at the moment, and said, "Okay, well, let's see if he was right." And that's just the rabbit hole I'm in. I'm just so deep in that rabbit hole that everything kind of comes back to that. So when I'm studying German idealists, when I'm studying Whitehead's process metaphysics, Buckminster Fuller, Wolfram, I can tie it all back to Flood because I think Flood gave us the archetype of scientific thought that we all use all the time still, right? and it's a big claim, but you just have to look at the implications of Kepler's astronomy on science. Did Flood have a comparable effect? Was his thesis just as strong as Kepler's? That's the question.
Well, did Flood have an effect? Were there people that followed Flood? So was there a division where some people followed Kepler and some people followed Flood, or did Flood's ideas just kind of die when Kepler opposed them?
Flood was at the end of the Renaissance and Kepler was at the start of the modern age, and we're still in the modern age. So because Flood was basing everything on ancient authority, he was saying, well, this person wrote that, therefore this. And the modern turn is to say, no, that's not how we do things anymore, right? We look around, we use skepticism, right? We need a new beginning and we can do things differently. And so, no, he was mentioned by people like Leibniz, for example. But he I don't know if you're familiar with the whole idea of rejected knowledge and esotericism as a school of thought. Now there's a school in Amsterdam where they are studying the history of Hermetic philosophy as rejected knowledge in the Western canon. So Flood would belong to that area, right? It was kind of like failed knowledge or rejected knowledge. And to be honest, I'm not sure how useful that is for us today in terms of trying to like do anything with it. I applied to the program. I was way too young to do it. But when it comes to my understanding of it, it really comes through, I mean, quantum physics, right?
Mm-hmm.
And kind of, okay, we have these paradoxes, like the problem isn't our methodology, the problem isn't our technology, it's our thinking, right? And everyone knows this. There's no consensus on quantum physics, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think Pauli's solution has some real meat to it because it grounds itself in something that we can all study on our own.
So what is Pauli's solution?
He approaches it as a scientist and he says, well, this proves the existence of a symbol that has both a scientific and a religious function. And that is the scientist's view of it. The religious view of it would be, wow, here's a symbol that can cause even the most skeptical atheist to have a revelation of God. Right? So,
in other words, you could come from either direction and still find a solution.
Yeah, I mean those are the two takes on it. Pauli was a scientist to the end, right? And Jung has a completely different view of something like this, right? This is the collective unconscious at work, right? And so it's all about the symbolism of the numbers and the Kabbalah as well, right? Stuff like that will be very important as a cultural thing. So there's just so many threads, right? And I have hold of one thread that goes back to that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's just how I'm trying to cultivate my channel. Now I don't know if you've seen my latest videos, I have the green screen up, and I'm trying to really just make this as basic and accessible and enjoyable as possible. Because I've written so much academic jargon, it's right. And I just look at it now and said, well, who wants this? I don't even want it. I want something, right? So something clear.
I had a little bit of the same kind of experience. I haven't written that much because it's way easier for me to talk my way through something than it is to write something. And I'm not as disciplined as I could be, therefore I don't get a lot of writing done. But I did have this big idea about this overlay between art and creativity and Jordan Peterson's project and how they fit together. And at one point, somebody asked me if I would do a presentation on that on their channel. Well, actually, it was the Jung Reading Collective. Is that what they call themselves? Have you run across that? There's this group of people who read Jung together and comment on it. And I can't remember what the name of the channel is. But anyway, they asked me if I would do a presentation for them. So I said, sure. And I spent weeks putting this thing together, and it ended up, even as much as I tried to reduce it, it ended up being over 2 hours long, which was way too much. And by the time I got through the whole presentation, I was like, I don't ever want to look at this again. I don't even want to think about it again. It just killed the whole thing for me. While it was alive in my brain and it was this beautiful thing. And then once I put it into words and tried to analyze it down to the point where I could convey it to somebody, it just killed it. So I understand that things can work that way.
Yeah. Buckminster Fuller says, the micro to macro process is inherently frustrating, right? It's in macro to micro just kind of happens, but to bring stuff out really is like, that's the work, right?
Mm-hmm.
So.
Well, I really like what you're doing with your channel, and all the things that you mentioned that are part of your rabbit hole are things that I've been looking at too, and trying to see how they come into this conversation. Some of them I haven't brought into the conversation just because it would require so much research on my part. I just wouldn't have an ability to convey it very well. Like there's this really good guy doing a series on Kabbalah. I can't think of his name. He lives in Israel. He's doing this very useful, but he talks super fast. And so you have to slow him down in order to understand what he's saying, but it's really good stuff. And I have talked to this she has a doctorate in psychology, but she doesn't call herself a psychologist. So I don't know what you call her, but anyway, she's also very interested in Kabbalah. She's a Jewish woman from Canada. Well, again, Toronto. She lives in Toronto. All these people in Toronto are so brilliant. So I have talked about that somewhat, but I'm also kind of gotten interested in this physicist named Wolfgang Smith. Did you happen to see the interview that I did with him?
Yeah. He talks very slow and yes.
Yes, you have to speed him up to listen to him.
Yeah.
But his books are wonderful. And he comes at it from, I think, very much from the standpoint of, he's probably somewhere between Flood and Kepler. He's still on the scientific side, but he's also really tied into the ancient wisdom and the ancient way of looking at things. And I'm going to have him and John Vervaeke talk to each other next week.
Nice.
So I think that's going to be an interesting conversation.
Totally. Yeah.
So if you could ask a question of those two guys, what would it be?
Huge question, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, boy, I don't know. I think I'd have to know more about Wolfgang Smith first. I know more about John at this point.
Well, what would your question to John be? If John is talking to a guy who understands quantum physics, and I think they're going to be talking about causation and cognition and things like that from the standpoint of, how I think it's maybe this whole idea of the observer and how does the observer fit into things,
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe my question then would be, what do you think of Wolfram for them?
Yeah, I would so love to get Wolfram, but I have not been able to find a contact for him or for his handler and it may just be that he's so busy that he doesn't do very many of these conversations. Like Michael Levin, this biochemist with the bioelectric signaling, he also is super busy, runs a big lab and has all these things going on, but he will talk to just about anybody. He'll be on these channels with 150 subscribers. And I also have a conversation lined up between Michael Levin and John Vervaeke. And they're going to be talking about cognition and consciousness and how far down it goes, whether it goes all the way down to the cellular level or the particle level.
Wow.
So I think that's going to be an interesting conversation, but I would love to talk to Wolfram. Did you happen to see the discussions that he had with Michael Chaitin, the mathematician?
No, I can't recall that one, no.
It's super interesting. There's two conversations that they did, and in both of them, they get into this question of the deeper implications, the philosophical and theological implications of the theory.
Okay.
Yeah,
Cool.
so you might really enjoy those. So I'll put those in the show notes too.
Nice. Yeah. I think my Wolfram video's taken off recently. It's got like 8,000 views now, and so now I'm wondering, because I wasn't sure at first if it would be good. Maybe I should do a follow-up video to that, right? And I think it would be, like you said, about this idea of computation, which seems to be gathering some attention now, and people are thinking, okay, well, what is it, right? And for me, like when I read Pauli's essay, when that was published in 1952, people would read it, close it, and that would be the end of it. But I could read it 10 years ago, call up all of Flood's books, scanned in high quality on my computer, and I combed through every book. And I saved all the images, right? And I did this kind of like archival work. And it was easy and free and quick. And so computation has allowed me to do my work, right? And so for this reason alone, I think Aristotle's definition of theology as a study of being qua being lines up not just with my experience, but with Wolfram. What he says, like his rhetoric is so theological from an Aristotelian point of view, which is still, we're still kind of in that in a big way, because it brings from physics and mathematics, and it aspires to the most general theoretical constructs. It doesn't slice off any part of being to study. It studies being as such, but you can't study being in itself. You have to study being as being, or qua being, right? And that's the distinction that I'm not sure Wolfram quite gets, or a lot of people get when they talk about science. It's like, we can't actually talk about the real stuff here. We're talking about this unsliced version of the whole. So maybe something along those lines, but maybe I should watch this video of him talking with Michael.
Well, the whole thing about being qua being as such, I'm glad you articulated that, because I always see that phrase and I'm like, what are they talking about? But now I know.
Yeah.
I've been thinking about this a lot, about when you think about agency, or how far down agency goes, or goals, how far down this goes in terms of, the scientists are always taking everything apart down to the very smallest part. And let's go with them there. And in Wolfram's system, that would be an eam. But even in his system, they've determined that every one of these eames has to be a particular eam. They have to have an identity. Every eam has to have its own identity. Even if maybe the identity is only its location in space and time. They all have to have an identity. But however these eames work together, or however these cells work together, it's all relational. It's all connected somehow. They have to have a relationship with each other in order to produce what they produce. And a cancer cell, the reason it's a cancer cell is that it disengages from the other cells and goes off and does its own thing. The cancer cell is not communicating anymore with the collective. So the community is over here doing useful, goal-oriented things, and then the cancer cell goes off and just starts proliferating on its own. So let's take it down to that level, either a cell level or a particle level, and think about what's the fundamental rule that has to be orienting that thing. And to me, it is that being is good. If you go down to why is there life? It has to be that the first cell thought life is better than non-life. If there's a thought, it's not a thought, of course, but being is good. Being is preferable to non-being. So you can't even talk about the first life, first cell, without thinking about why did it want to be alive? Even if you don't use anthropomorphic language like want or goal or anything, being is better than non-being. So value structure is right at the very beginning of everything, has to be, right?
I mean, you're talking about life in terms of like the principle of computational equivalence here, right? Like everything is equivalent on this playing field. And then there's like this self-organizing structure that works on certain systems and places, right? You're not talking about being is preferable to non-being in terms of it's better to be a fish than to be a rock.
Oh, right. No, but what I'm saying is somewhere there was, if you take it from the evolutionist perspective.
Okay,
I'm not even looking at it from a creationist perspective, just an evolutionist perspective. They think about the first cell being something that just sort of self-organized out of particles in a soup.
Yep.
And that somehow some oil gave it some sort of a boundary so that it became a single cell. But even that cell, even the simplest cell that we know of, has highly complex DNA in it that allows it to reproduce itself.
Mm-hmm.
But however simple that first cell was, in order to live and not, in order to become alive, life had to be preferable to non-life. There's some sort of a choice that goes on there. Otherwise, it wouldn't continue. Why reproduce yourself if it's not something that is better than not reproducing?
Right. Okay. So
Right?
there's like a vital force then at work that has a direction. Something,
whether, now Michael Levin is always talking about this bioelectric signal that's inherent in all life, is that something that's generated by the life, or is it something that comes in from outside? They never talk about this stuff, but
Yeah.
I mean, I think it raises lots and lots of questions that nobody wants to explore. Nobody wants to ask them out loud, because if you do, you're going to be accused of being a deist or being woo-woo, or
Oh, for sure. And that's the ego, right? That's a huge part of this, right? The ego is still wreaking havoc in science, and I think that's a big reason. I'm of the view that we have enough scientific material to chew on for decades, maybe centuries. So many people have done so much good work, but it's just sitting in this like TBD bin. We just don't know how to like fit it all together and like how this all works, right? Because I'm sure there's lots of people that have tried answers to those questions, right? They just aren't occupying the same sort of centers of attention, or they haven't gained the momentum needed to really get more eyes on it, because we're all individuals, right? We need to work collectively on things to really kind of get somewhere with it. And it's hard to, like, Wolfram's done it, right? That's great. People are working with him. That's fantastic. But it's hard to do that. It's not easy to do that.
Well, when he talks about computational equivalence, he's saying that even the simplest cell really can do computations that are equivalent to what we can do, or anything in the universe that can compute is equivalent to anything else that can compute. Once you get up to a certain level of sophistication, they're all equivalent, right?
Yeah, I see it more in terms of us, like we're computationally bounded observers. So anything that we're going to engage with outside of us is going to be computationally equivalent to us.
Mm-hmm.
So it's maybe an anthropocentric idea of it.
Right. And then, but then the way he uses that when he starts talking about it, because he also in some way says that, for example, the universe could be computing as equivalent to our computing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. But that what he says that implies is that we are no more important in the scheme of things than a cell. We're computationally equivalent, so it would be hubristic to think that there's anything special about human beings in the universe, because we're all computationally equivalent. And I think that's a pretty big stretch to make. I mean, as an implication coming out of computational equivalence, it could just as well be that everything in the universe is amazingly, brilliantly crafted and a tremendous gift, rather than saying, oh, it's all meaningless because it's all equivalent.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you're right. There's definitely a cup half full and a cup half empty way to interpret the principle, right? But the barrier, I think, that it draws, the line in the sand that the principle draws, is that we should never find ourselves in a situation where we say, oh, wow, isn't that complex? Oh, it's so complicated. Like, wow. I think science has relied on this to some extent, especially with like cosmology, right? Where it's just like so big or so small. And it's just, isn't it mind blowing? Doesn't it just make your mind explode? It's like, man, what are you talking about? We're computationally equivalent to all of this. And that's because in virtue of this principle that he's come up with. It doesn't mean that everything is reducible. There's pockets of reducibility, right? That's a distinct thing. That's a specific scenario, to use one of Fuller's words, that we can actually do work on as everything kind of sequentially goes through its motions. Yeah.
Well, so I thought at one point, and he may have disabused me of that notion, but I thought at one point this idea of the pockets of computational reducibility was that there's sort of a gift to us as human beings, that this, because if everything was computationally irreducible, we wouldn't be able to do science at all.
Right. Yeah, totally.
Right? So how do you see, I know when he talks about the pockets of computational reducibility, he says that from our standpoint as observers within the system, we've been able to look at a certain slice of it and find the computational reducibility there to, do science, to come up with equations and formulas and so forth. but that if it was some other kind of an observer, some alien or something, that they would pick out different pockets of computational reducibility. So that maybe that kills my idea of the gift. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that this is maybe Wolfram jumping the shark again a little bit with his speculations, right? Like it's easier to just kind of keep it simple. To me, the simplest explanation is Kant's explanation of the categories, right? It's a condition of possibility. And so the principle of computational equivalence to me is just a rehashing of transcendental idealism, which is the idea that, you know, these things like causation was the big one for Kant. We don't really see them out there, but the cause and effect is part of the preconditions of what makes our experience possible. And so the computational limitations on us are what make science possible, because that's where the equivalence is for us to understand it. Something like that's how I make sense of it. And then
if cause and effect is what makes life possible for us, what happens when science, as they are trying to do right now, is say that there is no such thing as cause and effect?
Right. Well, that's what Hume said, right? It's all just psychic habits. It's habits of our thinking.
Mm-hmm.
We don't actually witness any causation outside of us at all. And that's what made Kant do his work, was like, no, that's not good enough, right? We have to have some role for causality. And his solution was the categories. But to me, the categories are numerically symbolic. They are 4 groups of 3 things. And so now that's a theological kind of symbolism. And now I'm off into this whole tradition. But Wolfram is a quaternarian thinker. And you can see this in his, he's talking about a 4th paradigm already. And it's just like, man, no, there's no multi-computational paradigm. It's just the computational. Just leave it there. So that I just kind of see this as running way past the finish line. He passed the finish line a long time ago, and he's running victory laps, you know?
Yeah. Well, so there's four categories of 3 things. That's really interesting to me, because for a little while, I have a mind that tends to get thinking symbolically to such an extent that I sometimes think I'm falling into some sort of weird conspiracy theory, or, you know, so then I kind of pull myself back and I say, don't think about that anymore. But one of the pictures of Wolfram's theory, I'm going to draw it out really quick here.
Sure.
Is that when he first started talking about the rule, he talked about this turning into this. Mm-hmm. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's so beautiful. You know, because here you have the 3, and then you have the 1 turning into the 3.
Yeah.
Right. And I just thought that's got to be it, even though he was just stumbling around looking for a rule, and it could be any rule. But if it was just going to be any rule, wouldn't it be beautiful if that was the rule? Because that rule is the picture of love. That rule is the picture of sacrifice. And I think at bottom, it's love that rules the world. So it's love that creates everything. It's love that, so anyway, I get off on this thing.
Oh, that's great. No, that's wonderful, Karen. And I mean, I have a lot of the same sentiments, and sometimes I'll write and think in those terms. And when I try to bring that, let's say, like sort of emotional impulse or whatever to something that's seemingly very dry or scientific, right? The conduit to me is God. It's like, I want to know what Wolfram thinks God is, and I want him to have a systematic application of the concept of God in his computational universe. I need it. I want to see it. I think I know what it is, but I want to know what he thinks it is. Mm-hmm. And you can't, I guess maybe it's not fair to demand that from someone. But to me, that would be a step in the right direction. It's like, we got to have it, man. You've got everything else in place. Give us that extra piece, so that when we come to this work with an idea like love is everything, or, you know, things that don't have an automaton model for them, then we can latch on and be like, okay, well, that gives me something to work with. It might not be true, but who cares? That's not the point. That's what he thinks.
Did
Yeah.
you happen to read the article by J.P. Marceau that's in Symbolic World about love being the generator of everything?
No, I haven't seen that.
It just came out. And when I read it, I thought, oh my gosh, he's so much more articulate and he's put so much more meat underneath it than what I had when I was thinking about it last year. But it's the same basic idea. And the way I discovered the article was that John Vervaeke actually tweeted it out last week and said, "This is it!" exclamation point. And I thought, wow, that's pretty cool. Because it's locating, in my mind, it's locating God in the center of all of this, because God is love after all. So I'll put that in the show notes too. We're going to have really packed show notes today. So
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
So what are your goals for your channel?
1 million subscribers. No, yeah, it's just to practice writing. I'm writing a lot now to write these scripts, to bring this convoluted chaos in my head into something coherent that I can either show people or review myself. Because yeah, I do feel like I have to communicate something. I'm not sure what form it will be. Maybe it will end up being music, right? Something important in my life. But for now, it's a YouTube channel. So
that thing behind you, what does that represent?
this is look at the green screen. This is a work of art by a really good friend of mine. She's from Ukraine originally, but she lives in Canada now. And her name's Anna Yuschuk, and you can find her website in the description of my latest video. It's annayuschuk.com. She makes wonderful, abstract, mathematical, inspired works of art. So I'm very thankful to have it.
But does it represent something for you? Is it a picture of something?
Yes, Anna would obviously have much more to say about it, but I guess I like it.
Is it? I've heard like Eric Weinstein talk about things like Tauruses and what is that kind of bottle that has the weird neck that
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I do. No, I just like how it looks like I'm exploding out of my ears.
Oh, that never even occurred to me.
Yeah, it's fun.
But it does look kind of like it's a little bit like that illustration that you had from Robert Flood, where he showed actually this would be the mirror in the opposite way, rather than being mirrored with the base, with the peak being at the top and the bottom. It's flipping it so that the triangle goes this way, which I've often thought of the two triangles like this as being like symbolic of the chiastic structure, which seems to represent all of life to me, that life starts out in a certain way, and then maybe your prospects get narrowed because of all the choices that you have to make, that you're not choosing all these other things. So everything gets narrowed. And then at a certain point, you go through some sort of suffering, some sort of challenge or something, which going through the narrow spot. But then when you come out the other side from that narrow spot, your choices open up again, or your vista opens up again, because you have a new perspective on how the world operates now. So you come through this X chiastic structure. So a lot of the Bible is written with a chiastic structure, where you can actually see A prime, B prime, C prime, D, C, B, A, and you can see this structure in the writing where things line up as they go towards the center. And then the center will be the focal point, like what is the most important thing you're supposed to get out of this passage. And the world works that way because you have the beginning of the universe coming down to the incarnation and the resurrection, and then it opens up again this way, and history gets rewritten, and we start expanding into this world that Jesus has made possible for us through his sacrifice. So
Okay, no, that rings true to me because Buckminster Fuller says that God is the zero phase point of vector equilibrium, which is that center point,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Or in like Jung had this term enantiodromia, which is where something builds up until it spills over into its opposite. So something like that as well, is what it made me think of. But yeah, you're right.
I hope we can talk again, Dante. You're such a treasure trove of information, but you got me talking too much this time. So next time I want to hear more from you.
Well, of course, Karen, I'm curious about you. Obviously, you don't have a lot of videos on your channel. I combed through it that are just you talking. You had a couple there that you made with Wolfram, but yeah, because you have wonderful guests and the work you're doing is awesome. I'm just so glad to be here. But I think you can bring stuff to the table. That's great.
Well, part of it is that I'm so challenged technically. Like you do such a great job on your channel of bringing in all the visuals and the film clips. And so what are you using for your channel?
Yeah, I use Adobe Premiere, and that's the software to actually bring everything together. I record clips with OBS. If I saw you were looking for tips on this, if you want to do a quick tutorial, I can run you through it. I do this for other people too. I help people with tech all the time, so be happy to help.
Is that your day job, is working in tech?
No, I work at the YMCA. So we have a lot of seniors, and they're early. I'm there like 6 a.m. in the morning kind of thing. So and with COVID, everything had to be booked online. So now everyone's got to learn how to use the booking system, all that stuff. So yeah.
That's enough to keep you busy, but I'm guessing that part of that is it leaves your mind a little bit free for all this thinking that's going on in there.
Yeah, people always ask me what I'm reading. I'll have a book or ebook or whatever, and just kind of, yeah, it's this. So
Yeah. So what are you reading now?
oh, I'm reading a book by Peter Kingsley called Catafalque. It's about Carl Jung. It's been very good. And I'm always reading this book as well. If actually this book, I'm trying to Greek Mathematical Thought and the Origin of Algebra by Jacob Klein. And if anyone wants to help me understand this book, I've been working on it for years.
Do you have to be a mathematician in order to understand it?
No, but there's a lot of stuff about the Greeks, and I think the idea is that when we divide something in half, we can't understand how it becomes two things. I think that's the main insight. But
Well, so is it connected at all? Have you ever looked at the work of Nicholas of Cusa?
Yeah.
Is it connected at all with some of the kind of stuff that he does with circles and lines and all that?
Maybe I hadn't thought of that. Yeah. Could be. But
because Nicholas of Cusa is talking in very symbolic terms. So, I mean, sometimes if you can get the symbol right in your head, then you can go back and you can reinterpret the more scientific kind of stuff. Like for me, I'm really not a scientist. Anything I know about science at this point, I've learned from YouTube videos in the last 3 years, right? Because I listen constantly. So my brain is just full of this stuff. But when it kicks into place and makes sense for me is when I have a symbolic structure in my head that it lines up with this thing that I'm hearing. And then I can just, it's like all the doors open up and the bells and whistles go off. It's like winning the lottery. I can all of a sudden just see it and then it's complete. But if I don't have that symbolic structure and they're talking, I'm like, what are they even talking about? Like sometimes Wolfram will say things and like, what is in his head anyway? The way he phrases stuff. I'll give you an example here. If you have just another minute.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll play this thing for you and you can tell me what on earth he's talking about. We're just going to continue on from where we were and listen for a second.
Then there's no reason to say that there are multiple eames, and then you basically have a big crunch in the Rulliad, and the whole thing will collapse. So you have to have both of them. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so first point about the Rulliad is one of the key issues is, the Rulliad in its rawest state trees out everything. Okay, but there are equivalences which make the Rulliad non-trivial.
What does that mean? Equivalences that make the Rulliad non-trivial.
Oof. The rawest state of the Rulliad. I thought it only really had kind of one state, but maybe it's got a raw state.
Trees out everything. Well, that I kind of understand. I mean, it just starts at one point and then it starts to grow. That's what he means, basically?
Yeah, well, and also it means that it doesn't slice off any part of being, right? Which means that it's not the subject of any specialized science. It can't be studied by physics or by mathematics, but apparently it can be studied by computation.
Okay, well, I mean, that's what Glenn has been telling me for 3 years. Glenn has been telling me for 3 years that the world, well, actually, I've been corresponding with him for like 4.5 years, and he's been telling me that the world is computational. But I mean, computational, he doesn't mean like a computer. People always think that that's what it means, but that's not basically what computational means.
Computers do computation, but...
Yes.
Yeah.
But it's just a series of choices. But then he says, but what was the phrase that he used? Oh, equivalences that are non-trivial. What do you know what he means by non-trivial?
Yeah, I mean, my intuition here, like there's a famous quote by a philosopher named Quine, Lord Van Orman Quine. Let me see if I can just look it up. Everything. Let's see if we can find it. No, it's something like, everyone will agree that there is a single answer to the question of what exists, and the answer is everything, right? And like so the trivial answer to ontology is like, well, everything exists because ontology is the study of what exists, but everything exists clearly. Okay, case closed, right? But that's a trivial answer to the question of existence. So when Wolfram says that there are equivalences that make the Rulliad in its rawest state non-trivial, he's saying that like there's these matches, I guess, that give us more information about what it is to be part of it, part of the Rulliad.
Okay.
Right? So he's defending the relevance of the Rulliad in a sense. He's like, no, this is worth thinking about, kind of thing.
Okay. And so then he goes on to say,
okay, but those equivalences we have said are, but those equivalences are being made by observers. I mean, most of the equivalencing is done at the observer level. Okay, but so now what you're saying is that if you want to know, I mean, the equivalencing of eames and the fact that they are not all equivalent, you're saying is something that is outside of the observer. The non-equivalence of eames, in other words, being able to tell there are eames that the observer can equivalence.
Yes.
The claim would be that going the other way, that maintaining the eames as inequivalent is something not within the power of the observer. That is, an observer can equivalent. The claim would be an observer can equivalence eames,
but only because they're by default unique in the Rulliad.
Right, can equivalence eames for their own purposes.
Yes.
As an observer, but an observer can't establish the inequivalence of eames. In other words,
you see what I mean?
So now
I think to just take apart this piece right here, you could write a whole book of philosophy on that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, as long as Wolfram's enjoying it, that's great. But I don't know where it's going to lead, except for just further clarifying what he's already told us or what he's already aware of himself, even.
Well, what he just said there at the end sounds to me as though what it's basically saying is that the uniqueness of each eam is something that can't be accomplished by any power or entity or idea or scientific equation that's within the observer level Ruliad. It has to be something outside.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I don't know enough about the eam concept right now, I suppose, to really be able to evaluate that, but it just sounds to me like they're kind of trying to figure out how this new model could be used as a set of Lego bricks to reconstruct classic problems of epistemology and ontology.
Well, the eam level is just, I mean, they're just using eam in place of space.
Okay.
I mean, in his original iteration of it, you had time and space is just the atoms of space, is just the nodes. Space is those nodes, those parts that the whole hypergraph is made out of, the hypergraph that becomes everything. So all objects in the world are made up of the nodes and edges of the hypergraph somehow.
Okay.
The thing I can't figure out is if that's really the way it works, then what about the way things are all nested? Like, I mean, I'm a nested thing all the way down to all the cells in me. So if that's all made out of this hypergraph and then it's all tangled up with the next level and the next level and the next level, sounds like a big bunch of knots.
Yeah, I know.
It's conceptually much easier than it is until you start trying to think practically about it. When you start trying to think practically, it just blows up.
That's right. And like, I wouldn't consider myself a scientist either in the traditional sense, because I go on the Wolfram forums and people are doing stuff. I'm just like, man, I'm not even really a mathematician or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I'm looking at this and I just think, like, that's great, man, that you're doing all this great work, but like, bring back the simple stuff, like the early stuff from NKS to me is kind of where it is, but trying to recapture that simplicity in what I do too is its own challenge, right? Maybe that's what we're all working on, is trying to get back to the basics and to really connect and not have to worry about all that.
Is that why you moved from biology to philosophy?
Well, I came up with a game theoretic model for cultural evolution. Do you know what memes are?
Yeah, I mean, well, at a very basic level, I know that Dawkins used a meme to talk about a certain particular thing. I've never read any Dawkins, but I sort of have a vague idea of what he's talking about. I know what memes are on the internet. I know how to identify one when I see it, but I wouldn't have a good definition of it for you, but I can tell when I see one.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's now common parlance in that sense. But originally,
it's kind of a massive data compression in a way.
Sure. Yeah. Yep. So I came up with this game theoretic model for that, and it modeled what a meme was, and I thought, anyway, and my prof's like, you know what, you'd be better off in philosophy. So so that's kind of what happened. But and then of course I got right into all the classics at first, but again, coming at it from a scientific background, I was still an outsider. So I feel just a little kind of spread out, but now I've what's really important, what are the key ideas and concepts, that's my channel too, like what's worthy of being on there, what do I want to spend time to bring out, and that's helping me to focus. So
would you be interested in having a conversation sometime with Matt? Have you run across Matt on my channel? He's a philosophy guy.
You are reading the book that's behind you there?
Yes. Yeah,
I've seen those videos. Yeah, right.
Yeah. I've had a lot of conversations with Matt over the years, and he has a mind like yours, just full of all these beautiful images that I'm just grappling, trying to grasp it as I listen to it, because it's so intriguing, and I know there's a lot of deep truth there. But I think the two of you you could get off on Kant and all these people. It'd be a very interesting conversation.
Sure, I would love to. I mean,
He's very interested in the German idealists, and I guess I'd love to hear the two of you talk some about Whitehead, because Whitehead fascinates me, but also scares me a little bit, because after I started reading some Whitehead, then I looked into the whole process theology thing, and there are a lot of things going on in the process theology world that I'm not too fond of. Yeah.
Sure. That works. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'd love to hear some people talk about that, where I could kind of grok what's going on there and whether my understanding is clear or not clear. I mean, I just have intuitions when I listen, and my intuitions are just based on my reading of scripture over the years and the things that God has taught me, and not on any good academic grounding. So
that would be wonderful, Karen. I do need and would benefit from avenues, even just this video today, to focus and to say, okay, this is the next thing, right? This is my next video, this is my next talk, read this book. That directionality is very important to me right now. So that would be great.
Very cool. Well, listen, let's you and me talk again sometime too, because there's lots more that we could say about Wolfram. But in the meantime, I want to go back and do a little bit more listening to your work on flood. And then you also did one recently on Buckminster Fuller that was completely off the hook, man. It was so fascinating. I need to go back and listen to that again, but I haven't been able to do much work in it lately because I'm getting ready for these conversations with John Vervaeke and these other people, and
Of course.
It takes a lot of research to get that stuff nailed down. So
definitely, I look forward to those. Those will be great.
So anything you want me to put in the show notes, if you could send it to me, maybe even Anna, is that her name?
Yeah.
Anna's website, and any other information that you have about your work or any books that you'd like to recommend to people, send it to me and I'll put it in the show notes.
Oh, okay. That sounds good.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dante.
Yeah, thanks, Karen.
Have a great day. Bye-bye.